oil prices on the global market going up. This tells you that the magnitude of geopolitical impacts involved in this current war or conflict in the Middle East is not anything that any country, especially developing countries like Ghana, can take for granted. Why is it so important? Now we are seeing crude prices going up by nearly let's say, some people even say 10%, right?
Yeah.
Since March 2023. This is one of the biggest price hikes we've seen on the crude market. People are saying that it has not been able to get to what they call the fair value rate. It's been below around $75, $70 per barrel, and sometimes around $68 per barrel. Now, this war is creating a certain kind of projection into the future that if Israel should go ahead to attack Iran or some of their oil facilities, then we are going to see the repercussions.
The hike in price has a ripple effect on African countries, especially Tanzania, Nigeria, and Angola, countries that predominantly rely on oil, explore oil in high quantity in Africa. Ghana, we are not much in that stake, but we have a level of exportation of our crude oil. Nonetheless, if this tension becomes prevalent, or becomes erupted, it's going to really trickle down badly for some of the African countries where, as of now, there are proxy war happening. As you can see, Israel has so far restrained from attacking Iranian oil facilities. The key amongst them being some key ones in the south, in Iraq, and many have said that if that should happen, it's likely to ripple into other Iranian East African countries, basically. And interesting enough, these oil facilities, some have said that have U.S.-related ties, and they are strategic U.S. energy resources. So if Israel decide possibly to attack these facilities, it will somehow bounce back on Israel, since Israel benefit from U.S. backing.
Now, we've been looking at the data and we've seen that it is not just Israel attacking Iran, right? If Israel attacks Iran, what can Iran and their ally also do in terms of the attacks, in terms of some of the storage facilities that are in the Middle East tied to the West? This is actually the global crude prices that we've seen since the war started. This is from last year, November 2023, to what we are seeing. And as you can see, that stratospheric rise just between September and October 2024. We've seen prices fluctuating, going up. In fact, now we are talking about somewhere around $75 per barrel. I think last week it rose as high as $79 per barrel, and that was the highest since May or March 2023. So you can see the prices. The reason why Ghana is important in this mix is that we've been looking at our fuels and minerals imports, and we've seen that Middle East, especially the United Arab Emirates, is where we import most of our refined crude from. Especially after introducing the gold for oil deal, we've seen that a significant component of the fuel that we refined crude that we consume here in the country actually comes from the Middle East. Last year or two, we saw even Russia being in that kind of mix in terms of being one of the top partners in terms of trade in this, terrain, in terms of crude and what have you. So if the prices begin to go up, like we saw, just like you put it fantastically, during the Russia-Ukraine war, where we saw that kind of negative impact on the Ghanaian economy, where pockets actually started feeling it. We saw fuel prices rising as high as 23 Ghana cedis per liter, and then we saw all the kind of repercussions it had on the economy. Prices, inflation rising to somewhere beyond 40% and what have you. So definitely, if Israel decides to attack Iran and there are other repercussions, we definitely will have an impact on the Ghanaian economy as well.
Some global analysts have projected that based on the trade routes, which will come to that shortly, there's the need now, most have expected that the increased investment in protection of supply chain route. Now they need military protection because you can't use the same routes where the tension is quite prevalent. For the sake of attack. So, for instance, if the U.S. intends to supply some of these trade products to Africa or to the subseas, it has to be protected, basically because of the fear of attack. Now, every strategic infrastructure that is linked to the U.S., Israel, are likely to be hit by any attack. But one thing that is quite dynamic this time around, looking at this graph, as you can see, Iran is at the top, Iraq far right, Saudi Arabia, Persian Gulf in between with United Arab Emirates, Oman, and the hot Strait of Hormuz. This is a very important route, as you can see.
The Strait of Hormuz is very important. And you can continue.
So as you can see, this is a very strategic route that makes it accessible in terms of trade and production. So when goods are going to be sent, crude oil are going to be sent, this particular route here constitute about 17% of all trade global routes. So it's important for us to note that if this is happening, the tension over here is brewing. Surprisingly or unsurprisingly, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Iran, all of them have joined the BRICS nations. And this dynamic strain put a bit of tension on the U.S., basically because of the interest of trade at hand. Because these countries intend to break the petrodollar hegemony, they see that if this activity continues, somehow it will have adverse effect on some countries and also strengthen some currencies as well.
Now, you spoke about the Straits of Hormuz, and what we are learning is that, just like you put it, about 20% of the global crude trade passes through this stretch you see on your screens. And so if there are tensions around Iran and in the Middle East, this part of the country or the continent, definitely is going to affect global supply. And when supply is actually restricted, definitely developing economies, especially in Africa, that really depends on, just like I put it, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, Ghana. I think our trade in terms of pure minerals was about 20% from UAE. Definitely, if the tensions start to affect all of these areas and the route, it means that Ghana will also take a hit.
Ghana will take a hit hugely. One conversation that has become prevalent, which most African countries have not prioritized, is the need to all put hands on ensuring that the success of the African Continental Free Trade Area becomes a reality. Right now, that seems to be a kind of a fulcrum, a spokesperson, a frontier for Africa when it comes to involvement in global trade. If these tensions are happening now, what happened during the Russian-Ukraine war was that time we were not awake to the reality of the ripple effect of tensions in the geopolitics.
Exactly.
Basically. But this time, we should be awake. We should know that we should invest in intra-African trade. We should invest in trade amongst ourselves, ensure that we have the platform to ensure Africa can supply and feed itself within the constraint, not just rely on external supply.
Now, this is also very interesting. We are talking about the focus on Iran and why Iran is very important in this picture should Israel decide to attack Iran. We are talking about 3.2 million of barrels of crude oil, and about 1.4 million of that is exported. So that is actually more than half of the 3.2 million that Iran is able to produce every year. More than half of it is actually exported to be refined, right? And so that tells you that if Iran finds itself in this difficult situation of Israel actually going after some of its crude infrastructure, we'll be talking about that as well, the number of infrastructure they have, and how any strike from Israel will affect them. And some people are also, experts are also saying that should Israel decide to go after Iran, then Iran and its ally will also start to go after certain oil storage facilities in the Middle East that belong or have some ties to the West. So you are actually having a hit from the BRICS side, and then also from the Western side, we are also going to get a hit. So definitely, you are going to have supply, going to be cut as a result of this. But if you speak to experts, they also say that, look, fuel prices are below what we all expected. They is below what they call the fair value. So there is enough backlog, or what they call the inventories, to the extent that even if Iran goes blank in this supply chain, and this whole geopolitical game, game continues to unravel, there's still that sort of inventory for the world to tap in, and we might not feel it.
Russia can capitalize on this opportunity because Russia has a whole lot of petroleum crude oil stocks. So probably what the difference may be marginal price differential. Nonetheless, when it comes to supply and meeting industrial demands, I'm sure based on the ripple effect of these countries and how currently the global crude oil market has now become quite resilient, it will not be much. But the ripple effect will necessarily hit most of the African countries like Ghana and most Nigeria and countries who depend hugely, especially if you look at their budget, hugely depend on the success of the global crude oil price.
I mean, Nigeria derives a lot of revenue from crude trade, but definitely if you are watching us, what is in for you? If should this decide to take place, or should Israel decide to attack Russia, what is going to happen is that the global crude prices will actually hike, and when that happens, it means that the refined product that comes into this country will also be very expensive. You start buying fuel at the pumps at a very high rate. What happens is that drivers will start complaining, and transport fares will begin to go up. Traders in the market will also look at this and say that, look, if transport fares are going up, then what do? We are also going to increase the price of our wares, and that will trickle down to inflation, and that will affect your pocket. So it's not far away from us, just like it happened in 2019 when such a manner of such attacks happened in the Middle East. We all felt what happened. And then also during the Russia-Ukraine war, the same thing happened. But we are going to continue with the analysis. But if you're watching us, know that this is not far from you. Your pocket is not far from this analysis. We should all pray that, the tensions in the Middle East actually is calm. Now, it's still important to talk about
Iran oil infrastructure. So when we go to Iran right now, these are the kind of facilities you see in Iran. So far, there are 18 refineries and terminals in Iran.
So in fact, we are not just talking about crude, right?
Yes.
They also own refineries.
That is a serious investment. These are critical strategic national investment in Iran. Some of them are tied to the West. Nonetheless, some of them are tied to conglomerates of oil companies who have combined investment together to institute or manufacture or create some refineries in Iran because of its strategic position, basically. They have 10 also refineries, which are also critical, with 8 terminals. Terminals is where, when it comes to the export supply chain, most of them are strategic for global demands, and they've sustained that for centuries. And hopefully, when this happens, it means this nation may likely return back to ground zero. So that is the fear that most economists or most experts are saying, that if this will happen, Iran will be hard hit the most.
But Iran's biggest trade partner in this whole fuel or crude geopolitics has to do with China. There's already that sort of sanction by the US on Iranian product, but China still continues to do business with Iran because they say that, if there are bilateral sanctions, we don't care. We'll go ahead to do business with Iran. So Iran sells directly, and then in terms of proportional magnitude, a lot to China. And now that China is back from that long holiday that they had, and it means that they are going to resume consumption, and it means that they will need fuel from Iran again. And if Iran is your reliable supply source, then China will also do anything or everything possible to make sure that they protect Iran and the route that they also use to get the fuel. So this becomes more, like that global tension, the geopolitics that we are seeing, the West versus, the BRICS again.
China has played its cards well. As of now, the fear is the proxy nature of this conversation. With what is happening in the Middle East, China has positioned itself to capitalize on all angles. China has made sure they build a kind of economy that you can't take them out of the picture, irrespective of what happens. They decide based on trade. They will not come at you and say, if you don't do this, I'll give you that. They have the leverage and they play at the time they like, because they've strengthened the economy based on their strength, basically. So if China decides to trade with Iran, they are in a position to get that particular amount of money. And they have been consistent globally. Even what happened in Ukraine, China has a say. What happened in Russia, China has a say. And what is even happening now in Iran, China has positioned itself to make sure that through the BRICS, they are able to trade with the United Arab Emirates, trade with the USA and all the Iraqi East African nations, which is very critical, especially
Iraq
in the Middle East.
Iraq is not directly involved in this whole conflict.
However,
it's important to analyze them because of their proximity to Iran. When the tensions begin to escalate, and the the Strait of Hormuz that we showed you, tensions begin to escalate there. Know that it's not going to just affect Iran, that controls about 3% of the global crude trade. There's also Iran. That's about 4.3. They produce 4.3 million barrels, and about 3.3 million of that is actually exported. They also use the same route that we spoke about.
The same Strait
the same route.
Hormuz.
Yes. So it's not just Iran that is going to be affected, but Iraq as well, when pirates and this sort of attacks on
all these
and what have you.
That we've demonstrated to you as you're watching us is for you to understand or appreciate the nature of the conversation in geopolitics. We know we are moving into an election year. Nonetheless, the whole trickle-down impact of what is happening globally does not exempt us from the reality of waking up to knowing that indeed price of commodities, price of goods and services have gone up. Nonetheless, the whole trade trajectory. Now, moving goods basically through this route has become a key challenge. Now, if you want to supply a particular product to Africa, it is going to cost more because of the risks involved in bringing those goods through the same route, which constitutes about 20% of global trade. Now, if instead of the time factor, it's going to take a longer time to receive your goods based using this particular route. It is quite strategic to know that the cost of production or cost of supply is going to increase, and there's the need to diversify our investment, not just focusing on international trade, but as a continent in Africa, there is the need for us to shape, taking advantage of the opportunity presented by the African Continental Free Trade Area. But there's been interest divided against who is doing better and who has the advantage. Nonetheless, we have to make sure that we have a united front in the continent, not just speaking, but making sure that trade routes are open. But nonetheless, if we are to bring it down to Ghana, we can say that it will hit our energy sector nonetheless.
Now, when the energy sector is hit, definitely, we are talking about refined crude. So the first has to do with the transport sector. There's also electricity that's also involved. Thankfully, Ghana produces majority of the LNG, the gas that we actually consume here. So that aspect, we are a bit safe. But in terms of the crude and the refined crude, we're talking about spare inventories. And should anything happen,
basically buffers.
The buffers, what's the globe going to rely on? We're talking about that 6 million barrels of spare production capacity readily available. Where is it coming from? It's actually from this side, Saudi Arabia, UAE, but all of them are also along the same route. And so, it is up here, but in terms of those who are going to give you that sort of cushion when the attack happened, they are also on the same in the same region as well.
The fear of not being entangled in the whole tension is one thing that has become quite difficult. We saw when the tension began in the 1st of April, when Iran decided to attack the embassy of Israel, where a missile was hit there through using a drone. And the key tension then, where African countries like Kenya and some key aspects decided to release statements saying that the tension should be mitigated. Nonetheless, we've seen interest being expressed proximally over the world. But now with these key countries in the southern part of the East, it is quite important for them to know that they have all interests aligned, basically through the BRICS and other inter-allied trade opportunities.
Yeah, now, beyond energy and beyond fuel and what have you, petroleum and what have you, there's one trade partner that we really need to analyze as we get to the end of this conversation. That is China. And China trades with Iran directly. They consume a huge component of the refined crude and even the raw crude that is actually produced in Iran. Now, remember that China is one of the biggest trade partners to Ghana, and we import almost now everything from China. And so, should China, have issues with production in terms of high cost because of restricted supply and what have you, then it simply means that the goods that are going to move from China to Ghana will also be very expensive. So beyond the energy sector, one other, part of trade that will really be hit will be our trade with China, how expensive that will be because of the increase in production. You spoke about the risk. The risk will also be calculated into cost when those oil is actually being,
China gave a rising impact in terms of the global hegemony or running for African resources, because we saw China taking advantage of the African continent. Therefore, we saw the need for other interests being expressed by the bigger nations. Nonetheless, with what is happening now, China is in a good position. Ghana, African nations need to ensure that we just don't negotiate based on our outlook, but based on our resources. That is a factor. That is something that should strengthen us. That is something that should help us build buffers against global tensions, such as what happened between Russia and Ukraine and current rising between Israel and Iran.
I mean, you speak about building buffers, but how do we build buffers when we have a very vulnerable economy, when almost everything that we consume in the country is actually imported? I mean, we are talking about refining crude. Ghana is actually one of the oil-producing countries in the world, although we are not a big part of the OPEC, community. But Winston spoke about strategic, policies in terms of refinery and what have you. Position yourself in terms of this geopolitical tensions. You need to really play the game well to be able to benefit from both sides. You do not possibly need to take sides. We've seen how, possibly, maybe if you look at the data, how Ghana became one of the biggest consumers of Russia, mineral fuels in terms of export. And so, in terms of imports as well. And so, this is possibly a disadvantage, but if you look into the details, it could be an advantage to the country as well.
Now that you've appreciated the data, next time you hear a headline, make sure you have more clarity in terms of what is happening globally. So that's this edition for today here on Beyond the Numbers. Next week, we have an explosive interview for you. Make sure you don't miss it as well.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Next week will be interesting. We have a very interesting conversation and an interview with the Bank of Ghana on one key instrument that has been introduced, which is the
Ghana Gold Coin.
You wouldn't want them.
So be expecting. So that'll be all for today. See you same time next week. Bye-bye.